Hey, Sandy.
Great having you.
She told me Sunday I could call her Sandy.
That's right. First name basis. That in itself is an honor. Let's start at the very beginning. What neighborhood did you grow up in? Let's start with that.
At the very beginning, after I was born at Wesley Memorial Hospital, my parents took me back to their apartment, which was in a building that no longer exists, 1444 North State Parkway, when the Gold Coast was not the Gold Coast we know now, but it was kind of, it was shabby, but there were a lot of mansions turned into rooming houses. After my brother was born, 16 months after I was, they moved to, and I'm very glad they did, to an apartment at 1715 North Park in the heart of Old Town, and that is where I stayed for the next couple of decades.
I read somewhere that,
Don't believe everything you read.
I know, that's why we're interviewing you.
Yeah.
Stutz Terkel was there when you were born, and he toasted your
Not
birthday.
exactly. He was
Not-
there.
not in the
He
room,
was,
yeah.
knowing my mother would have been fine with her, but he was not in the room.
But he celebrated your birth.
Yeah, he was the guy. He was a dear, great friend of my dad's, and he is the guy who, when I wish this tradition still existed, he took my dad out for a drink, and that it was for the early morning I was born, where they got a drink at 4 o'clock in the morning. I have lost to history now, but I'm sure they were knew enough bartenders in town to have some guy open the place and celebrate my birth. So I mean, basically, I knew Studs from the time I was born. Yeah.
Well, you were bestowed by him. It was like a knighthood. This baby shall be a journalist. He shall be a writer.
There's also some genetic predisposition in that. My father was a journalist and author of many, many books, many of them about Chicago, other books that he wrote to pay the tuition bills for my brother and myself. But yeah, I mean, I was, and my grandfather, a Russian immigrant, sold newspapers at a newsstand in Humboldt Park, so maybe there is some kind of genetic predisposition to, certainly to get into the newspaper business, but also to write. One of my earliest memories is the sound of the typewriter in my father's office on the west side of our apartment in Old Town, and he had a little office there, and it literally is. I know it sounds terribly romantic and maybe fake, but the sound of a typewriter is my first memory. And it's a glorious sound that I haven't heard enough in newspaper newsrooms for the last 30 years, but it got in my blood.
Tell us more about your parents. Your mother as well was in the newspaper business.
My mother and father met at a restaurant that was called Ricardo's that some of you, I know Don certainly remembers. It was a glorious gathering place for writers and ad men and all sorts of other creative types at the corner of Rush and Hubbard, run by a guy named Rick Ricardo. They met there and became so important in Rick's life and he in theirs that my name is actually Rick and not Richard. A quick story that in 4th grade at LaSalle School, I still remember her name, Mrs. Corrigan was my teacher, and she insisted on calling me the first few days of class Richard. And every time she did, I would say, Mrs. Corrigan, or I talked at the time, Mrs. Corrigan, my name's Rick. Well, no one's name is Rick. Rick is a nickname. That's a nickname. Your name is Richard. So I made the horrible mistake of one night after this, early in my 4th grade career, of going and telling my mom this, who then insisted on going to school with me the next day to straighten out Mrs. Corrigan, which she did in no uncertain terms, as I recall. It was not until many years later, when I was a little older, that I realized that Rick Ricardo spelled his name R-I-C. And I said, Mom, if I'm named after Mr. Ricardo, why is my name spelled R-I-C-K? And my mother said, well, your dad and I didn't want to be unconventional. And I said, you named me after a bar owner. And she said, well, it thought it'd be easier for you. They met there. My mother was for a time, worked for the Tribune, writing short little movie capsule reviews and doing some modeling. She was a stunningly attractive young woman. And she and my father met there in 1948. They met Studs and his wife Ida there. They met everybody who was anybody in Chicago there at a time when places like that and places like O'Rourke's and places sort of like the Ale House is where writers gathered. It doesn't happen so much anymore for a variety of reasons. My mother, when we were born, left the newspaper business and eventually became the head of public relations for the Art Institute and then the head of public relations for Doubleday, publisher in Chicago. And she was a lively woman. When I got even older, I thought to myself, okay, wait a minute. My mother worked at the Tribune, and she would tell me stories about Colonel McCormick, who she adored, as nutty as he was, because he would invite her up from the newsroom to sit in his office, and he would tell her stories. He had a fondness for young, attractive women, of which at the time there were not that many women in the newspaper business. So he'd have my mother, Mary Lou, up there, and eventually he trusted her enough to walk his dogs. He would say, Mary Lou, take my dog. The dog's name was Alada, because she had a lot of puppies. Not the most poetic stroke of genius, but that's who it was. And then she told me that his chauffeur, when Colonel McCormick learned that my mother was, when my mother was going to night school, he would have his chauffeur drive my mother to and from night school. And when I was old enough to know about men and women, I thought to myself, Jesus, maybe I'm the illegitimate son of Colonel McCormick. And I could then, I certainly have enough money to live forever, but I might also be able to have a piece of the Tribune that I could edit and publish the Tribune. I never brought it up with anybody except my brother, and my brother knew my mother well, said, you know, that's a real possibility. It's a real possibility. They got married in 1950. I was born in 51.
Okay. But your parents also...
These are the insightful stories you're going to get about literature and newspaper.
You had some interesting guests at your house, though.
Well, my father had been and was, around the time I was born, the drama and book critic for the Chicago Sun. And he and my mother attracted a very, very artsy crowd and liked to have parties in our relatively small living room. And some of my earliest memories, too, aside from the typewriter, were my brother and I trying to go to sleep down the hallway and hearing loud conversations and the joyful click of ice in glasses. And eventually, invariably, my mother coming in and waking us up. She'd be a little loaded, but waking us up and saying, come on, boys, come in and say goodnight to all the nice people. And we were not old enough to say, you know, Mom, we are asleep. And we've already said goodnight to everybody. She would drag us in our little, pajamas covered with cowboys and Indians or race cars or whatever they were. And we'd walk into this living room. Music was playing, booze, of course, tinkling in glasses, smoke just filling the room. And it was so exotic, even for me now. And we would say goodnight to people like Stubbs and Nelson Algren, who for a time dated my mother's sister. Remember to tell you that story. And it's like, and people like, Marcel Marceau and Mort Saul and Nancy Kelly and entertainers who were coming into town. It wasn't any kind of formal salon that they had. They just had a lot of serious cocktail parties. And so that I didn't know who any of these people were. I remember meeting Mort Saul very early on, and he told my brother and I that he was from Mars, and we thought that was very intriguing. And but it was, yeah, it was it was wild. It was wild.
It sounds wild, yeah. How could it not be?
And in memory, it's terribly lovely, I think.
Yeah, it is. So when did you actually start working, and what age were you when you started working for the papers?
Well, I had a lot of weird, at one point, Old Town was such a remarkable place to grow up at the time. It was a very heavily German, Japanese, Hispanic, so it was a wonderful crowd. Among the crowd, my best friend growing up was Ty Bowler, who was the grandson of Patty, Chicago Ready for Reform Bowler, the alderman of the 43rd Ward in which we lived. And Patty is not a long way to answer your question. Patty ran his ward organization out of a saloon at 403 West North Avenue, just west of Central. The building still stands. But Ty and I would go over there with some frequency, maybe every month or so, because we knew if we could just sit there and answer Patty's stupid questions, he would give us money to go buy ice cream at Ward Committeeman John Merlot's ice cream parlor just up North Avenue. And Patty is, I did not realize that I was Jewish. We grew up my father was an emotionally and intellectually lapsed Jew because of, he fought in World War II. And that just killed religion for him. My mother was a lapsed Catholic because she'd been married once before, and the church doesn't cotton to divorcees. Well, how I learned that I was Jewish, we'd go to Patty's salon, he'd go, "How you doing, boys?" And he'd sitting there, the big fat slob that he was, and he didn't care about us. He didn't really care about Todd's family either much. And we tell him, "We're doing good in school. You keep doing good in school. You keep doing." This was a total conversation, month after month after month. "You got any A's?" "Yeah, we're getting A's, Grandpa." And he said, "Here," and he gave us each $10. It's only 1960. And we're like, "God, we can buy a car or something." And we'd go. We wouldn't always go to Merlot's ice cream parlor. But some years later, talking with my dad about Patty, probably about 12 or 13, and my father told this story about it. He was in Patty's saloon. A lot of reporters used to hang out at Patty's saloon because he would throw good parties. Slob that he was, and he threw good parties. And he very much admired my dad because my dad had written, among many books, a book called Lords of the Levee, which was a remarkable book about the former bosses of the First Ward, the guys who, Don would agree, was kind of set the bar for political corruption that no one has ever reached that level yet. None of them have. And I think Patty greatly admired these two guys. And my father knew, he certainly knew Hinky didn't Kenna, and he wrote this book. And so Patty really admired my father. So one day he said, "Come on, I go to, you know me, I go to Hong Kong every 3 months, and I go to Germany every 3 months, and come with me. I want you to come to Germany with me. I want you to come there. Great beer halls, marvelous places, and I know everybody there. They'll treat us like kings." And my father's, "No, Patty, I can't. I have too much work." "Oh, come on, Herman." This goes on for about 20 minutes. Finally, my father says, "Look, Patty, I'm Jewish, and I cannot go with you and drink in the beer halls where the Nazi Party came together and was founded. I simply can't do that." And Patty rubs his big fat face, contemplates this news that my father is Jewish. And he finally says, "Come on, Herm, can't you let bygones be bygones?" That in essence is Patty Ball. So stories and stories like that were always there. And we would sometimes go down to the paper with my dad and hang around there. I wrote a column, I know my father arranged it, for the Near North News, which was run at the time by a guy named Lou Mariano, who has a park named after him on Rush Street. It was kind of a gossip column. I'm 13, for Christ's sake. A gossip column about Old Town. Ty Ballard had it was literally like this. Lou Mariano was an interesting man, but I can not, he wasn't Russell Baker or somebody. So he would run this stuff, and there was notes by Ricky, and it would say, Ty Ballard got an A in math last week. And Ginger Bowler got a new dress, and Mandy Latham got a haircut. I mean, really incisive kind of gossip. And I would write it. I mean, I would write it, but it was kind of lame, limp, and insubstantial.
So you never thought about pursuing anything other than writing? You never thought, well, maybe I'll be a lawyer or...
Oh, God, no. Cowboy, baseball player. You know, the typical kind of childish dreams that one has. When I was at LaSalle, and we were assigned in 5th or 6th grade to write a story about the Chicago Fighter, the history of which I knew intimately, because every time I would ask a question of my parents, we'd go see Spartacus, for instance, downtown at the McVickers Theater, and come home and say, Dad, tell us more about Spartacus. He would get down an Encyclopedia Britannica, which we got on the shelf, and says, here, read more about it. He never, it wasn't because he was lazy. He thought, you know, we should get deeper knowledge than whatever it was he could tell us. So I knew about the Chicago Fire, and I wrote a paper about the Chicago Fire, and the teacher accused me of not writing the paper. She said, your dad wrote this. I said, no, he didn't. My dad's a better writer than it was just 6th grade nonsense. And so I guess because I read so much that I might have had some spark of writing talent. I never really pursued it. We wound up going from LaSalle. When I was in 6th grade, my parents got the news that my brother and I, when it was time for high school, because there were no magnet schools or anything, would be going to Cooley High in the middle of Cabrini Green, the newly built Cabrini Green, which even at that time was a dangerous school. So like a lot of parents in different areas of Chicago, no matter where, and many public schools were being terribly diminished and disenfranchised then. My parents had the choice, as many did, whether to move to the suburb, move to Evanston, go to ETHS, or move to Oak Park, go to Oak Park River Forest. And they decided to stay and send us to the Latin school, which was at the time $800 a year. It is now $45,000 a year. And so we did go there, and there I eventually started writing for the paper, but there were kind of idiotic pieces. One was a review of Tom Wolfe's electric Kool-Aid acid test, not that I had done acid at the time. And another was, why don't you people come out and watch us play football? We're not being supported by the crowd. So I think these were really baby steps. I wouldn't call these journalism by any stretch.
Right. When did you start working for the newspapers? When did that all come about?
You're not coming to Near North News? Boy, I did not go to college. I went to Circle Campus in 1969 for a variety of reasons that I won't get into. I applied to a lot of colleges, got in a lot of them, and just we couldn't afford it. And my uncle was the head of the English department there, a wonderful guy named Rick Kogan, who was called Babe because he grew up as the best stickball player in Humboldt Park. The reason I stopped going there was my first class, my graduating class at Latin was 38 people. 38. My first class at Circle was in an auditorium 4 times this size. And the book we were assigned was A Red Badge of Courage. And I thought, well, I read that as a freshman in Latin and wrote a paper about it, and maybe college, it was kind of a culture shock for me. And so I started driving a cab and pretended to go to school because I didn't want to embarrass my parents, and I was living at home. And one day, having heard from my uncle that I was not attending classes, my father said, "Are you bored?" I said, "It is, it's bored, Dad. I think I'd be better off, learning life." And this is the life-altering conversation we had on the back porch of our apartment. He said, "Well, what is it you want to do?" And I didn't think it would ever get to him. My father was a 3-year Phi Beta Kappa at the University of Chicago, living in Rogers Park, and this was in the 1930s, and working midnight to 8 for the City News Bureau. He could have guilt-tripped me back to college in a heartbeat. But he said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I grasped at this fabulous opportunity to just be presented to me and said, "Dad, I want to drive a cab." And he said, "Okay, why don't you try that?" And I did for 2 years, writing terrible short stories, driving a cab, thinking naively in 17, 18, that there would be all these great stories from my passengers. And so generally when I would say, "Hi, you want to go to LaSalle and Randolph? Why do you want to go there?" "Shut up and drive." Shut up and drive. 99% of all my fascinating conversations consisted of "shut up and drive." Or "what's the matter with you? Just drive." That was it. So I did that for a couple of years, 2 years or so, saved up enough money, and then decided that I would be Ernest Hemingway. And I saved up enough money, $1,500, determined to go live in Europe for a year on $1,500. At the time, there would be some incredible round-trip tickets you could get. I can't remember what they were called. It was like $100 to fly in from Chicago to anywhere in Europe and back again. So, okay, that was $100. Went over there, lost half my money. Flew to Paris, stayed there with a friend who I had known, a waitress, borrowed her car, drove down to Monte Carlo, which I thought was a wonderfully exotic, great thing to do. Put on the only suit I had brought with me, a white khaki suit. Went into the casino in Monte Carlo, and no drugs, no booze. Thought, this will be it. I will win enough money to live here in Europe for the rest of my life. So I bet half of my money, $750 on a game that I'd never played before or since, roulette. Black. Red. Whoops. The only joyful part of that was afterwards. Some nice couple, I wish I knew where they were now, said, "Young man," much older, "you need a drink." And I said, "Oh yes." Looked at a map, said, "I know Greece is cheap. I know Spain is cheap. Spain looks cheaper." So I drove down, I sold this woman's car, drove down to Spain. The car conked out in the middle of Madrid. I left it there. No cell phone, I just left the car there. I eventually made it up to her, but left the car there. So depressed, got on a train, went down to Malaga, which is on the southern coast. Got out, walked around Malaga, did not speak one word of Spanish. Got on a bus going east, and the first stop was as if I was in the middle of Gary, Indiana. Smokestacks, and I said, I can't get out of here. Got out, got on a bus going the other way, fell asleep, woke up in the morning as we're coming into this little town. It was called Estepona, still there. Got out of the bus, got off the bus, walked around for a while, went into a building that was on the beach, a small 4-story apartment building, and said, "Do you have rooms here?" And my theory is that the guy working the desk had convinced whoever owned this building that he spoke English. And I don't speak any Spanish, so we're talking and doing numbers, and he convinced me eventually that it was $40 a month to live there. And I signed some papers, and I gave him a year's worth of $480 and said, okay, well, I'll be here for a year. I'll figure out, it's still like $100. I'll figure out how to do it. And I lived there for a year. Wrote a travel story that was published thanks to my dad in the Tribune, and they gave me $150 for it, which is still what they pay now. And this is many, many years ago. But that was like, oh my God, I could eat for the next 6 months. But I did manage to stay the entire year, came back. My father said, what do you want to do? Dad, I want to be a writer. And he said, well, maybe you should go to, I have a lot of friends at Columbia College. I said, oh, okay, that sounds good. He and Mike Alexandrov and Stubbs kind of founded Columbia College at a booth at Ricardo's, for Christ's sake. And so I went here. We're in a class where the person said, well, you all want to be writers? What do you want to write for? Half the class said, I want to write so I can be on TV. This is about 1973. And I thought, okay, this is not my place either. But I was lucky enough to get a job at a magazine that was being started by John and Abra Anderson. She, the granddaughter of Nelson Rockefeller, of John D. Rockefeller, and went to work in a magazine called the Chicago, which they started. This was at a time where the Chicago magazine, as we know it, was little more than a guide to WFMT shows. Worked there for a year and a half. That thing folded. Went to work freelancing for the Sun-Times. Got to know a wonderful man named Bill Newman, M.W. Newman, who was then the editor of Panorama, which is the great art section that my father had founded in 1963. Got to know Bill. I was 23 years old, and Bill asked me in his inimitable way one night over drinks, Rick, do you think you'd like to work for the Daily News? And I said, God, I'm sure I would, Bill, because I was driving a cab again. I would like to work for anybody. And he then had to call me back and say, and this is another, the yin and yang of being Herman Kogan's son, he said, I can't believe this, Rick. I can't hire you because your father still works for the Sun-Times. And there's a nepotism rule here. So I continued to freelance, and a couple years later my father retired, and Bill was able to hire me as a staff writer for Panorama, and that indeed, in 1978, that indeed began this so-called newspaper career.
How many newspapers did you work for?
The Daily, Near North News, of course. The Daily News, for the last 6 months of its existence, folded on March 4th, the birthday of Chicago, 1978. Then, in a while, went to work for almost immediately went to work for the Sun-Times. Rupert Murdoch bought the Sun-Times in 1984, and I quit. Idiotically, I suppose. The Tribune at the time hired a bunch of Sun-Times people, most notably Mike Royko, who charmingly said on television the reason he was leaving is this Rupert Murdoch published newspapers that no self-respecting fish would want to be wrapped in. He publishes junk. Mike went to the news. I was determined now that I was going to start my novel writing career. I got asked to write the history of, out of nowhere, the history of the Brunswick Corporation. And when they said, how much would this cost? I told them exactly what I had made at the Sun-Times, and they said, oh, that seems fine. Did that, then eventually started freelancing for the Tribune and doing some on-air work for Channel 2 as a kind of arts and entertainment reporter. And then the Tribune offered me in 1989 the job of TV critic. And I could not freelance that, and I took that job. And I am now, holding on with my fingernails at the so-called Chicago Tribune.
When did you get on radio? When did that all start?
Well, when I was at the Sun-Times, these nice folks at WDBM Radio called and said, Rick, would you like to be an on-air critic? At the time they had, I think, Glennis Sykes, the theater critic for the Sun-Times, was doing some stuff, and somebody else was doing a little thing, and I said, sure, I love that. And again, naively, I went in, did a 4-minute review of I was doing bars and taverns and arts and entertainment. And they said afterward, they said, that's great, we want you to do this on a regular basis every couple of weeks. I said, fine. They said, you're gonna have to join AFTRA. And I said, sure, I don't care, whatever it is. And joining AFTRA, even at the time, was $750. And I thought, well, of course, I had the illusion that everybody on TV and radio made millions of dollars. So I remember writing a check to AFTRA and getting my first check from Channel 2, and it was $3.72. And I called, I never married, a wonderful woman named Denise Hines. She was married to a reporter named Burley Hines, you may remember. And I said, Denise, something is wrong with my check, I think. And she goes, what is it? I said, well, I think there are a lot of zeros missing here. And she said, no, how much is it? I said, it's $3.76. She goes, no, that's right. They take out a little money for taxes. And I said, well, how much do I get? She said, $5. It's $5. I did that for a while. That was the beginning of my radio career. When I was at the Tribune, this happened, I'm trying to remember, a guy named Mitch Rosen, who now runs the Score, called me and said, hey Rick, how would you like to have a show with Richard Roper? And I go, a show about what? Well, I'm thinking of calling it Media Creatures, and you can talk about media and do that. I go, okay, well, when would the show be on? He says, well, it would be on from 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, 5 days a week. Now, that's very elite for me. I didn't even know Richard at the time. So we did that for 6 months. Then I was occasionally a guest on, it was fun, but very demanding. A guest on Kevin Matthews' show and Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer's show on the Loop. And one day I'm in there, it would be, Rick, tell us about what comics are in the Tribune this week. And I go, what? And so Jim DeCastro, the head of the station, comes in and goes, you're really good at radio. How would you like a show? I go, sure, give me a show. And that was the biggest station at the time in Chicago. I said, sure, give me a show. I go back to the paper, this on a Monday or Tuesday, and on Friday I get a call from a friend of mine saying, when do you get a radio show on the Loop? And I go, what do you mean? Because they're advertising this new Sunday show with Rick Kogan. And I called Jimmy and said, this is real? This is real? Yeah, we're calling it the Rick Kogan show. And I thought, Jesus Christ, I have no idea what to do. It was a Sunday morning show from 6 to 10 on Sunday mornings. So I said, well, okay, I'll do this. Let's call it the Sunday Papers, okay? That Sunday, I go into the station. There's a 12-year-old engineer there going, who are you? I go, I'm Rick Kogan. Oh yeah, you got a show. Do you have any music for me to play? I go, no, I didn't even know what I'm supposed to do here. He goes, well, your show, you're on till 2 o'clock. So I thought that I'd be like Fiorello LaGuardia and read the comics or something. But I hadn't read the papers beforehand. So the worst radio show imaginable, you know what I'm saying? Well, hi everybody, this show is the Sunday Papers. I'm Rick Kogan. Wow, look at this interesting story on page 2 of the Sun-Times. Dead air while I'm reading the story. I wish those tapes existed. I would fall over in horror. And then did that show for a while. Then WGN asked me to do a morning show, which I did for, I guess, 10 or 15 years, and then I switched to, well, then WBZ had me on as a host for a while, and it was interesting, and now I've got the show that you were a star of last summer. Yeah, last summer.
Let me throw some names out, and tell us what you want to know. If you don't
Pardon
want, I'm going to throw out some names, and you can share some stories. Okay? If you don't
Are
want
you
to.
sick of my stories by now?
Studs Terkel.
Well, as you know, Studs was a great friend of my father's, and he and Ida were great friends of my parents. And after my dad died in '89, Studs and I became not inordinately close, but Studs' son Dan, who's a wonderful guy, was not terribly close to Studs. And Studs' hearing was sort of going out of whack even then. And so he would ask me with joyful frequency if I could accompany him to various events that he would have around the city. And I loved doing it. Studs never drove, never had a driver's license. I have never owned a car, but all those years of driving a cab made me a great driver. And so we would go to all manner of events because Studs was Studs and in great demand. As he got a little older, it got to the point where I had to sort of stop him. One day, I pick him up, and I go, where are we going? And we gotta go to Highland. We're going to Highland Park. Highland Park. I go, what's the event? I'm speaking at a book club for 6 ladies. The last event we had was at the Harold Washington Library for 500 people. He never could turn down any of these things until I convinced him that he needed 90, that he needed to turn down some of these things. He was a dear man. When I was young and at the Sun-Times, I wrote a book or a collection kind of called Dr. Nightlife Chicago about area saloons and taverns. And because Studs was friends with my dad, he had me on his radio show. I think I told you this story Sunday. And I came on the show, and I hope some of you remember Studs' show. If not, there's an amazing archive that includes not all of his shows, because there's something like 8,000 of them, but many of them. One of the best, if you happen to go on the site, just Google WFMT Studs Terkel, blah, blah, blah. There was a great day in 1967 when my father and Mike Royko hijacked Studs' show to interview him on the occasion of the publication of Division Street America, the first of his many bestsellers. And it's riotous, because my father and Mike adored Studs and he them, and it's a good interview. So he interviewed me, and I was like, Rick, who you write about on page 84? You write about Ricardo's, that's where I met your mom and dad. And Rick, on page 72, you write about the Earl of Old Town. Let's hear some Steve Goodman. And it went on like this for an hour. And at the end of the hour, he said, well, what do you think? You like it? Was it good? Was it good? It was remarkable. My knees are weak. It was so good. What can you tell me? What's the secret? What's the secret? Read the book. And that has informed everything. I probably knew it before, but that's informed everything subsequent to that morning radio show. He was a great inspiration. We spent time, and last time I saw him, I had brought my then 2-year, maybe she was 2 years old, Fiona, daughter, and she had never met Studs before. And we were sitting in Studs' living room, and we get there, and of course, Studs was very old at this time, 95-ish, 6. And of course, it's a crew from Canada, 60 Minutes, leaving the house. He'd just been interviewed by Carol Marie. And so we sit there, and Fiona, many of you may know what a 2-year-old is like. They're not the most quiet kind of creatures. So she's sitting on his lap, and Stubbs is telling stories. We're talking about all sorts of things. And after a while, after about an hour, he says, I said, you should be going to sleep now, okay? Well, Fiona, I want to tell you something. I loved your dad, and I loved your grandpa, and I loved your grandma. And grandma was a wild woman. I hope you don't grow up to be exactly like her. You should have some of her best qualities. I want you to have her best qualities. But you know what I want for you, Fiona? And I'm telling you, she is sitting there as if he is a doll, a human doll. You know, he's got the red check shirt, he's got white hair flowing, he's got rubber bands wrapped around his hand, and she is wrapped. She is just wrapped. And he goes, you know what I want for you? I want you to grow up. I won't be around when you grow up. I want you to grow up in a world where nobody is hungry, Fiona. Do you understand? And she's like, not here. Where nobody hurts another human being, nobody hurts an animal. That's the world I want you to grow up in. And I am sitting over here sobbing. And Fiona's nodding the whole time at every wonderful thought he has for her future. And the then still mother, but then ex-wife, comes and grabs feet, and Stubbs says, Rick, let's have a little taste. So we each had a couple fingers of scotch. And that was the last time I saw him. He died on Halloween that year. But that's and there is a remarkable, Colleen, the mother, who was a great mother, came out and took one photograph with an Instamatic or something. I didn't have a iPhone. And that is my favorite picture of all time. It is literally the picture I would like to see in my mind when I die. It's a very extraordinarily meaningful picture to me because he, I don't know if Fiona will remember it. She's now 17 on her way to college, but how's that for a stud story?
That's a hell of a story.
Well, yeah, and another quick stud story. He would always talk about, I remember rushing back from Christmas in Michigan to write the obituary of his wife, Ida, who was a lovely, lovely, lovely woman. And then Stubbs, everybody thought at the time that Stubbs was going to go like that because Ida did everything for him. When she's the one who would say, Rick, if I didn't dress Stubbs, he'd be dressed in rags, which is undoubtedly true. And Stubbs would talk about death all the time. He would say, Rick, I'm like ivory soap, 99.4% dead. And I'm like ivory soap. It was 99.4% pure. But he kept Ida's ashes on the windowsill of his house, always with some yellow daisies every day, fresh. And he would say, I'm the first person he ever told this to. He told everybody once he realized what a good line it was. He said, Rick, you're in charge of this, so when I die, I want you to take my ashes and make some with Ida's and bury me in Bughouse Square. Okay. So I don't want to talk about this, but I got it. I'm not old. I'm getting older. And I finally said, it's against the law to do that. Against the law. Let them sue us. That was Stubbs.
So what eventually happened?
Eventually Stubbs died on Halloween. Dan, his son, was in charge of cremating him, and on a beautiful May day, it may have been Stubbs' birthday, the following May 12th, we went to Bughouse Square, and about 6 of us, maybe, planted, and studs and Ida went in the ground. The tree is no longer there, which breaks my heart, but they're ashes. Studs would understand. Studs would understand.
Yeah. Another name that I don't think people associate with you, but you wrote a book about her, Ann Landers.
Yeah, I sure did. Well, what happened with Epi, one of the great things, when Mike came over from the Sun-Times to the Tribune in 1984, right after Murdoch bought the paper, and Epi Lederer, who was the name of Ann Landers, the real name of Ann Landers, had to wait for 3 years until Murdoch sold the paper, and she was thereby freed from the syndicate. Came to the Tribune, and for a while her column was edited by a marvelous guy, the former editor of the magazine named Dennis Goslin. And Dennis retired. And he said, Rick, you're going to get a call from Epi, which was okay with me because I'd known her since I was a child, another person I'd known since I was a child. She was not part of the hard-drinking crowd in the living room, but in 1955, a woman named Ruth Crowley died. Ruth Crowley had been writing the Ann Landers column, a very simple kind of advice column at the time. And they had a playoff between 5 women to replace dead Ruth Crowley. Epi was one of them. She was friends with one of the editors. My mother was another one of them. They selected Epi, and my mother was always, well, they give 5 sample questions, and these ladies answered the questions, and Epi got the job. Primarily because one of the questions was, yes, my neighbor has an apple tree, and some of her apples fall into my yard, and I have used these apples to make apple pie, and now this neighbor wants to sue me. She calls to answer this question, someone she had gotten to know in the Democratic circles of Wisconsin, where she lived for a while. She called William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, to answer this question. Another of the questions was about interfaith marriage, Jews and Catholics. To answer that question, she called one of the loves of her life, Father Theodore Hesper, president of Notre Dame. And that elevated Epi above the other women in this crowd who just made up the answers to themselves. So she became Ann Landers and became, to my mind, almost without argument, the most syndicated columnist in the history of American journalism. After Dennis Goslin left the paper, she did call me and said, Rick, you're an editor there now, aren't you? I go, yeah. Would you edit my column? I said, sure, Epi, I'd be honored to edit your column. But I must tell you, I'm not a regular reader. And this Epi was like, she goes, well, now you have to be, won't you? And it was not a paid position. It was, I just felt terrible that no one who was part of the Tribune at the time, Tribune-like pattern, had thought to call a woman who made a fortune for that newspaper and its syndicate. So for 4, 5, 6 years, I edited the column, and it was very, very little editing to do. It wasn't as if you're really wrong about this or something. I would maybe update the names instead of her using, well, this reminds me of Bob Hope. I put in Jay Leno or something, but it was very modest. And we would, she'd go, Rick, I would like to pay you back for this. And I go, you don't have to pay me back. I'll take you to dinner every once in a while. And I think the real reason she wanted to go to dinner every once in a while was to hear great gossip. So the first time we go to dinner, she lived at 209 East Lakeshore Drive. And I smoked at the time. And she despised smoking, so I was standing outside in freezing weather, like going like this with my coat and trying everything to get the smoke off. And I went upstairs, and as she opened her door, and she's, "Now, just Rick, stay here, show yourself around the apartment. I'm on the phone with Al Gore," which will tell you exactly what time it was. And so I would wander around this glorious apartment with glorious views. And the most remarkable piece of art, to my mind, that she had was this Salvador Dali sculpture of John Fitzgerald Kennedy that was about this tall, made with clay and paper clips. It was astonishingly beautiful. And so she gets off the phone and she asked me a question to which I could never even bullshit an answer. She goes, "Now, Rick, is it cold out?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Should I wear the mink or the ermine?" Like, I don't even know what ermine is. I go, "I think that ermine will be okay." And we went out to dinner, and that was a famous night. We went to the International Club at the Drake Hotel, where she had a little name plate on the table. And it was a regular, obviously, and we're sitting there, and I am literally, by 40 or 50 years, the youngest person in the room. And I said, "What did Al Gore want?" "Well, he wanted to know," I can't remember if Al Gore had said it or the other candidate said that they once done cocaine. She goes, "Now, Rick, can you tell me anything about this cocaine?" "Well, what does he want to know?" "How do you do it? How do you take it?" So I said, "Well, I've seen this happen. I could show you." So I empty a salt shaker table. "Now, what are you doing?" So this is sort of what cocaine looks like. It looks like this. And I took a credit card. "Now, what are you doing there? What did you do?" Intensely curious, this one. I said, "Well, I'm putting this, I think they're called lines of cocaine. Lines of cocaine. And you put it like that." "Yes. Then what do you do?" So I said, "Then you take," I don't have any $100 bills, but I do a $1 bill. You take it and you roll it up, and then you close your eyes and inhale it. "Well, show me." I said, "Well, I'm not going to inhale the salt. I'll show you what it should look like." So I'm doing this, and as I'm bending over, it goes, look at this room. And I look around, and every one of these ancient diners is staring and looking at us. I go, "Abby, this is embarrassing." "Oh no, this will be the talk of the neighborhood for weeks." So I show her what it's like to do cocaine, but she was a doll, and to my mind, a great journalist too. So after she died, and she died very quietly and privately, she didn't want to announce it because she said that there would be thousands of people lining up with home remedies on East Lakeshore Drive, and it would cause a problem for her neighbors. Seriously. After she died, I'm loath to write anything more than obituaries and somehow capitalize on someone's death or even get a part of it. But I kept hearing from people that she's going to be forgotten and no one would remember who she was. And so I decided to do a book called America's Mom that included, it was a narrative biography of her and also included 30 some, not quite testimonials, but short little takes on people who have been affected by her. She is, I've been able to prove otherwise, she is the first newspaper writer to use the word AIDS and address the AIDS epidemic in print. She also marvelously admitted to changing her mind about homosexuality. That she initially thought it was an aberrant behavior, and then she realized what it was, a natural thing. The most affecting one was from an alcoholic, of course name was not mentioned in the piece, who said that he had stopped drinking because he had lost job after job after job, and was up for his final job, and instead of going to the job interview, he went into a bar to have a drink. And while I was having this drink in the morning, he was reading the paper, and he read an epi column in which she mentioned a new organization called Alcoholics Anonymous. She was also the first person, arguably, to mention Alcoholics Anonymous, saved this guy's life. He's become a sponsor to dozens of people over the years. Another very moving one was a guy who used to work for the Department of Cultural Affairs, and I'd known this story for a while, but he allowed me to write it in the book, that he grew up on a farm in southwestern Wisconsin, and as a young man, he thought something was wrong with him, that he was attracted to men, to other young men, and he couldn't make heads or tails of this. He never went to movies, his parents didn't have a television set, and this is in the early 60s. So he literally thought he was going mad. He was thinking of committing suicide. He didn't know how to explain this. One day, he reads, his parents got papers, and Ann Landers was one of their favorites. He read her column, in which, and it's a pretty famous column, in which she addressed the nature of homosexuality by printing a letter from someone saying, you know, I am a homosexual, I am also an uncle, I am also a brother, I'm also a son. Just an incredibly moving letter. He read this letter. His father was out in the field, his mother was doing something else. He tore it out of the newspaper, threw the newspaper away, and left it on the kitchen table. He went to school, and during the day, as you might imagine, got so terrified. This might not be the right way to do this. He came home from school, and he saw both of his parents standing on the back porch, and he was shitting in his pants, frankly. And they opened their arms and hugged him. And that's a story when anybody wants to know. Well, Ann Landers, she was this funny little lady who talked funny and had a weird hairdo. She touched and affected millions of lives, and she was a good person.
Let's see. If we need to drink of water, there's a bottle right there.
Okay.
Mike Royko.
It was great because one of the great things about being me is being the son of Herman and Mary Lou, because people really admired my father and liked him because he was a decent guy and a great historian and a good newspaper man and a Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine. And so when I started the Daily News, Mike, who was not easy to get to know and was generally could be fairly remote with people because he was busy at the Daily News for a time. He wrote 6 columns a week, for God's sake. Imagine. And with a batting average of 800 or more. So he didn't quite befriend me, but he was nice to me. And we got along, and I liked to play handball, and I liked to play later tennis and racquetball. And Mike was nice enough to write the introduction to that aforementioned book, Dr. Nightlife Chicago, which was the last thing he wrote before his wife died. And that, if any of you want to see the soft side of Mike, look up a column that he wrote when he came back to the paper called The November Farewell. It is literally, to my mind, the greatest 800-word short story I've ever read.
I still remember that.
It's
all these years later, I still remember.
Yeah, and so, and Mike and I did a lot of drinking together and a bit of carousing together. I wish he'd left the paper early. I wish he and his second wife, Judy, had gone off. He had some dream for a while of moving to Ireland and writing a novel. That I would have loved to have read, because I do indeed think he's the greatest columnist that has ever written in Chicago, and given the state of the newspapers, ever will, So Mike moved to Winnetka with Judy and their two adopted children, Sam and Kate. And he would not come down to the office with the same regularity that he once did. But sometimes he'd come down, and sometimes he'd like to get on the road back to Winnetka before rush hour. So one day he goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing. I was watching TV, a TV critic." So he goes, "Let's go get a drink." So we went down to the place that he has made world famous, the Billy Goat Tavern. And no one's there in the afternoon, so we sit down at the end of the bar. The great Jeff McGill is the bartender there for 35 years, and a wonderful guy and a great golfer. He said hello, he brings Mike a vodka, he brings me a vodka. And so we're drinking, and sitting down the other corner is a guy watching TV who started drunk, who starts in on Mike like I've seen very few people do. It's, "Oh, look who's here, big man, big shot, Mike Royko. Look at him, look at him." And Jeff said, "No, don't leave him alone, they're just having a drink." "Oh yeah, big shot, thinks he can go anywhere, big man, hated daily." I'm just unrelenting, trying to get a rise out of Mike. And we're not paying much attention to him. Jeff says, "He's been here all day, I think he lost his job or something." And so we have a couple drinks, and finally, after this, Mike, hey, look at you, you're a lot balder in person than you are in your photo in the paper. I mean, any insult this goof could think of. And so he walks down to the end of the bar, and in those days, I would always get up to stand between Mike and any potential trouble, because if I get in trouble or hit or something, or hit somebody, nobody's gonna know. If Mike does, it's Walter Jacobson fodder on the news. So he comes over and I go, "Look, what do you want? Leave us alone. We're just trying to have a drink, man." He goes, "Yeah, big man. I suppose he's too good to give me an autograph." And I wouldn't even ask him, "What's the matter with you?" And Mike turns and says, "Autograph for who?" "Would you really, Mr. Ray? It's for my Uncle Henry. And Mike sometimes, after a couple of drinks, would feign this British accent, which I never understood, because when I'd ask him what was going on, I go, "Why are you talking like, Laurence Olivier?" "What do you mean, lad?" And if I asked him 2 days later, I go, "What are you talking about?" So he says, "Jeffrey, my good man, fetch me a quill and some parchment." And Jeff goes, You want a pen and a Billy Goat bag?" "Yes, my good lad." So he comes over, Jeff puts down the bag and a pen. Mike turns to this guy and goes, "Your uncle's name, young lad, your uncle's name." "Oh, Mr. Rourke, I'm sorry, I was yelling and saying those things to you. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. I lost my job today. My girlfriend left me. I don't know what I was talking about. But if you could make it out to my Uncle Henry, that would be the greatest thing." So Mike takes the bag. "Be gone." Kid looks at the bag, goes, "Oh my God, he's gonna love this, Mr. Royko. Thank you so much. Can I buy you guys a drink?" "Be gone," I said. So the kid, he starts to leave, and I said, "Let me see the bag." "Dear Uncle Henry, your nephew is an asshole. Sincerely, Mike Royko." It is literally the most inspired barroom moment I can remember. And the great thing for me now is somewhere in Schaumburg or Tinley Park or somewhere, Uncle Henry has, of course, that frame in his basement. And my only hope is that Uncle Henry's friends occasionally would go down and go, "God, Royko was right again. Your nephew is an asshole." There are a million stories that I can tell you about Mike, about his tender side and about his, he was something. And there's one story, he and his boy Sam were fishing on a pond on his country club, Sunset Ridge, and he was snubbed by Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was coming down playing, and little Sam was like, Dad, can I have his autograph? And, as opposed to Mike Ditka, about whom Mike wrote a column about what a jerk McCaskey was to fire him. And Ditka may still, I know he did for a long time, may still have that column folded up and in his wallet. Yeah, Mike, there will never be anything like Mike Rick Kogan. 25, he's been dead 26 years this April, I think.
Yeah, I just read that too.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And it's still, Boss is still among the great. One more story about Mike. He wrote Boss, well, he didn't take a year off to write Boss. He wrote Boss on weekends and at night while he was doing his regular job. Because Mike, who also didn't go to college, was ever insecure about his own worth and talent. He could be a difficult guy, no question about it. But so one Sunday, he goes down to Ricardo's, which used to be right next to the Tribune, sometimes, and Tribune, and he sits down at the bar, 3 in the afternoon. Jose is tending bar, and Mike comes in, and he goes, Mike, I don't see you for a long time. What's the matter? What's the matter? He goes, well, Jose, I was working on a book. Oh, that's great. You finished the book? Yeah, I'll celebrate. Give me a martini. So you finished the book. So Mike is sitting there quietly drinking a martini, celebrating by himself the completion of one of the great political biographies ever written. So about 10 minutes later, Jose comes back over and holding a sort of frayed, beaten up copy of a Mickey Spillane paperback. And he goes, Mike, maybe your next book you can read this one when I finish. And I'm thinking, you didn't get it, Jose. But the gesture is so sweet. He's offering Mike, who he thinks has just read a book, not written a book, a Mickey Spillane book to read. I love that story.
That is a great story.
Thank you.
I know we gave cards to everybody if they wanted to write any
You
questions
just scream
or
out a
comments,
question if you
but
have
you could also scream out a question if you've got. Not.
Whatever happened to the lady and the apples?
The lady with the
Was that ever resolved?
Yes, well, it was resolved in a test. So one of the things I would love to discover somewhere are I don't think they exist, but the 5 women were offered this job, and they each got 5 questions, sample questions, and Justice William O. Douglas said that because these apples had fallen in this woman's yard, they were her property. I'm no lawyer, I don't know, and I'm certainly not a Supreme Court judge, but I trust him on that thing. And as far as the interracial marriage one, I don't know, but if you have Father Ted Esberg addressing it, I'm sure he gave some kind of compelling answer. That's a great question. I wish I could find it.
Do we have another question? Otherwise.
It's more about, you're saying that you don't have formal training, right? So you basically went from this process of osmosis in a way because of your parents and all the people around you. But there's so much that is involved in writing, the process and just proper vocabulary. How did you get from there to there?
Well, but I think, I'm not against any kind of academic training, but in the old, people like Ben Hecht and Carl Sandburg and other people who used to write for the Daily News had no real serious academic training, nor certainly no journalism. There were no journalism schools at the time. My brother, Mark, the younger brother, went to journalism school, went to Medill, and he spent zero time in journalism. I think there is something, being curious and doing, my father always maintained, and I will maintain this, that you can become a good writer by reading good writers. I really, really believe that. you know, and always will, I think, and having, I think you're right, but that's why groups like this, where you can, you know, commune with other writers, and writers groups are incredibly valuable, because you can't, I guess Homer wrote the Iliad by himself, you know, but you know, you read about someone like Hemingway, you know, had some training, but just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. Then there's someone like, you know, there's an interesting piece in New Yorker this week about James Patterson, who has sold, ready for this, 400 million books. Think about that for a second. I think there are great writers who nobody reads. Certainly great writers who nobody buys. You know, a lot of it these days has to do with, as we all know, marketing has a lot to do with it. I think if you have something to say and you're willing to put in the hours to try to say it, and then be in some kind of group or with someone who might give you some feedback, is the way to do it. I'm not saying it's better than some kind of academic background. I think an academic background, depending on, you know, my daughter is thinking of not just thinking of it, I think she's going to major in creative writing at Denison. She did ask me, she was a freshman in high school, she went to Jones just over here. One of the great questions, she's a great kid. I said, Fiona, do you have any idea what you want to do? She goes, Dad, I like to do art, and I like to write. Can I ask you a question? Yeah, sure. Dad, do you think when I get out of college that there will still be any newspapers? And I'm like, that's the toughest question as the Mink or Ermine question, frankly. There will be journalism, but ink on paper, I don't know.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question is, there's a lot of negative press, so to speak, coming out of Chicago. And we won't get into that, but as a lifelong Chicagoan, what still excites you about Chicago? What still excites you about Chicago?
Everything. Turning the next corner has always excited me, because a city is an organic thing. There are some areas of this city that are so beaten up, disenfranchised, and terrifying that it breaks my heart. But I don't have to take a look at the beam. I can be walking down virtually any street in this city, turn the corner, and see something I've never seen before. Whether a person, or a sign, or a store, or a building. Yeah, I'll be amazed, frankly. You know, JB and Laurier in New York trying to convince, or Washington trying to convince people to have the Democratic Convention come here in 24. That's going to be a tough sell. And I think one of the problems with the current state of affairs is that violence is now everywhere. And it breaks my heart too to talk to older people in Chicago, people, lifelong Chicagoans, who tell me they're afraid to go out after dark. Not at, Garfield Boulevard and Western Avenue, at, Rush and Bellevue. That really breaks my heart, because if you don't have people out getting involved in the city, that's where the heartbeat of the city starts to get fainter and fainter and fainter. You know, you look at the Loop now. I mean, it's, or Michigan Avenue, the number of stores that have closed, and I'm not the world's biggest fan of tourists, but I don't know how some of these businesses survive when no one's coming in. You know, one of my best friends in the world owns Wendella Boats, and has since he was a young man. He started on the boats when he when he was 16 years old with his father, ran the boats. And it breaks his heart. I mean, he remembers days when there were bodies floating in the Chicago River. And it breaks his heart now. Nobody should have to live afraid. And if you're feeling that way in Chicago, I still do go out at night. But I know a lot of people who don't, and I know a lot of people in the suburbs who would not even think about coming to Chicago after dark. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see if any of you ever visit, for whatever reason, a place like West Pullman. It is, you could take someone and spin them around in various places in West Pullman, and you could convince them they're in fucking Mississippi in the mid-60s. The deprivation is palpable. Palpable. There are people who still do not have indoor toilets in Chicago. And I think the city has been, for far too many decades, just let the disenfranchised, one of the things that say, let's put all the black people in jail. That'll take care of it. First it was like, hey, let's all put them in these high rises. Let's get them out of the way. There are a lot of things to be ashamed about Chicago, but I do love Chicago, and I will never not be hopeful for Chicago. That may seem terribly, terribly naive, but it's not the first time I've ever been naive.
No. You're probably speaking for all of us, actually. Do we have other questions, comments, anything else that somebody wants to?
How many of you still subscribe to the Ink on Paper Tribune? I'm just curious.
How many read it online, at least? Well,
Wow.
that's good, yeah.
Wow. I can't read it online. I'm inept at technology. That's one thing. It's totally inept, and I've been reading papers, and the Tribune's getting smaller that way. And I know that is certainly the future.
The sad thing is that when you buy the paper and you want to read certain things, because I'm a lifelong reader, all of a sudden all the content is coming from .com, from different sources from New York, from,
Yeah, much of
it's
it
not
is.
local, it's not
Yeah,
as
much of it is. Well, the Tribune, I've sat there while, friends and colleagues and Pulitzer Prize winners and everybody else have walked out the door. I mean, and I don't blame them. I don't begrudge them. Many of them have had, incredibly good runs, but the days of, I've been writing over the last 5 weeks or so, a 6-part series on the history of the Chicago Tribune. And it's reminded me of the days when a newspaper was literally an essential in people's lives. It's made me appreciate what the Tribune has been. And I am not privy at all to what the Tribune may become. I'm sure there are people in Rome somewhere planning the future of this endeavor, but the printing plant where we now have our offices, having been moved from the Tribune Tower, having been moved from fancy offices at the Prudential Building, we're now in there, but that there is not going to be there once this cockamamie crazy casino goes up. The paper will be printed somewhere, but it's certainly not going to be in a building that has offices for staff, and the staff's small now. Small. I feel it too, dear.
Well, when all these people were leaving, there was this mass exodus, it seemed like. I can't tell you how relieved I was to see that you still had a column.
Sorry?
I was so relieved to see that you were still at the Tribune when everybody was leaving.
Isn't she nice?
It's true.
Isn't
It's
she
true.
nice? Well, one of the reasons that I'm still there is I've never been, as indicated by my reckless bet in Monte Carlo when I was a young man, I've never been good with money, so I don't have any kind of retirement fund. So, you know, can get Social Security, but that ain't enough. That ain't enough. But you know, every day, it's like walking around the city. Every day, I see something worth writing about in order to tell the story of somebody who otherwise would not have a story told. You know, the stuff I do generally is not stuff of front page news, but it's certainly worth reading about and knowing about. That's why I still like doing the radio show too. It's like an ongoing graduate school of sorts. And you know, if Marianne Pressman wrote a new book, and as much as I like her and as long as I've known her husband, you know, if I wasn't doing the show, I might not be able to find the time for the book or something else. And it's life is about learning to me. And Studs, and my father too was like that. It was all about curiosity. You know, Studs wrote his own epitaph, and it was, "Curiosity did not kill this cat." And I like to think the same. I think that's what kept all of Studs' brothers and his father, they all died young in their 50s. And Studs lived to 96. 96. Without, as far as I know, ever spending one moment exercising at all, except lifting an elbow. That's about it. Yeah. But, you know, the whole, he also wrote a book, and I cling to this too, the title of which was Hope Dies Last. And so as a result, I remain hopeful about almost everything. Even as bleak as it can be, you cling to hope. It can be, I think, like a life raft. Yes?
I think one of the death knells for the newspapers here was way back when the Daily News went under. People on the left politically would read the Daily News, and the Trib, though this isn't fair because not everything in the Trib is always very conservative. So I always thought that Chicago was bigger than just a one-paper town. It really deserved that balance, which was lost with people like your dad and Rick Kogan to keep navigating to wherever it was.
Well, I think one of the problems, I was on the Daily News when it folded.
So many of the people you talk about started.
Well, sure, I think, you know, it was, the Tribune, certainly under the inimitable, the father I never had, Colonel McCormick, was incredibly conservative. The Daily News, the Sun-Times was actually started by Marshall Field as an alternative voice. The Daily News was always kind of left, I suppose, with a great foreign staff. But all of that, what killed the Daily News in large part was the fact that people were getting their so-called afternoon news on TV. And I think now we have, Fox News makes Colonel McCormick look like, Saul Alinsky, for Christ's sake. I think now that it's a lot easier for people to watch television and get their news and opinion, so to speak, from, you want to be left, I suppose. CNN is that way, that they try to be balanced. You want right, there is Fox. And there is Fox as a former, sorry. I want to screw up your tape. There is Fox as and I will tell you as a former TV critic, every interview is 2 minutes. Hey, Newt Gingrich, what do you think? Hey, Newt Gingrich, what do you think? Hey, what do you think? What do you think? And it's all focused at the people who believe what they're saying. It is preaching to the already converted, but it emboldens the person out there who goes, yeah, they stole that election. You think they stole the election? Watch Fox. They'll tell you you're right. They'll tell you you're right. And I think that kind of balance, it takes more time to read something than it does to listen to Sean Hannity and Newt Gingrich talk for 3 minutes. And I think that's the problem. I don't mean it's we become a short attention span world, but in a way we have. You know, TV killed the afternoon papers. TV and the internet has done its part to beat the shit out of newspapers in general. And so, you're right, I get wistful for the days when, if you wanted to be an informed citizen, you'd read the Tribune, the Daily News, and the Sun-Times. Maybe toss in Chicago Today or the American, one and the same. But I don't, it's like, you know, it's like walking up, Fox News is like walking up to a crazy person in a bar and trying to say, hey, let's have a talk about this. Conversation has been killed, I think, in large ways by the TV news shows. I really do. And it's a tragedy, yes.
Do you think it's also a dumbing down kind of a thing?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's easy. You know, most people are watching TV, you know, not wrapped, they're not taking notes about this, but it's just, they'll get enough to reaffirm whatever their beliefs are. What, Stonewall election? Look, they stole the election. Hey, Mike Pence, I'm sure people are disgusted by that, but I guarantee you there are other people out there going, yeah, they should have got him, Terrifying. Yes.
If a 1 minute radio commercial takes 150 words, a 2 minute interview is 300 words.
Yeah. I know. And you look how beaten down, certainly I am, by the commercials for especially this the Republican gubernatorial race. I sat in, just because I was curious. Sometimes it's not making any endorsements any longer because they're hooked up with a nonprofit, with BZ now. They're not going to make any endorsements. Tribune still is. And the tradition in newspapers is to have candidates come in and speak their piece. I sat in on the Republican candidates meeting with the editorial board of the Chicago Tribune, now headed by my great friend Chris Jones, theater critic, and the editorial board. And after this thing was over, and they each got to speak their piece, I met Chris outside, and I just went, woo. These guys collectively made Bruce Rauner look like Abraham Lincoln. I mean, aggressive, say nothing. It was to my mind pretty appalling. And when you're right, Mary Ann, when you think of, you know, why we vote for someone, it's not, well, I believe their policy of this. It's like, I saw Richard Irvin, he painted houses in Rockford, in Aurora, so I'm gonna vote for him. Or so-and-so's a crook, I'm not gonna vote for this person. It is all down to that soundbite, that one, and it's millions, tens of millions of dollars spent on these ads. It's obscene, is what it is. It is obscene. But it also shows how easily manipulated voters can be, and why I can't even imagine why anyone these days would want to get into politics. Who wants to be mayor of Chicago? I mean, it seems to me to be an impossible job. But look at all these people who want to be. And we'll see who it is, because there's no chance Lori can get 50% in a field this crowded. She'll be in a runoff if she gets in a runoff. And that, in many ways, is the future of this city too.
On that happy note.
Yes, I was just going to say yes.
I know I speak for all of us at CWA and for everyone here in the audience who came today. Thank you so much for being here today, for
It's my
sharing
pleasure.
your
And
stories.
CWA, I mean, for those of you out there, if there are any who are would-be or beginning writers, this is the kind of organization I'm talking about, that gives support and encouragement and nurturing, especially for those of you in the early stages of, there are a lot of people I know, virtually everybody who wants to write a book. And it's very difficult to sit down, as many of you know, and write a book without a ton of dough in the bank and people to encourage you and nurture. Encourage and nurture, I think, are two vastly different things, but you need them both. You need them both. So those of you who are doing that, onward, and can't wait to read your books.
Well, thank you for all that
Oh,
you do.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.